Hey guys, my name is Trevor Sullivan. I'm a solutions architect with StratusGrid, and I'm also an AWS ambassador. StratusGrid is an AWS premier consulting partner, and we're also an ISV or independent software vendor. We have a software solution, a SaaS platform called Stratosphere, which you can see right here. And what Stratosphere is designed to allow you to do is to connect all of your different AWS and Microsoft Azure data sources to it. And then we provide recommendations on how to improve your cost operating efficiency in the cloud. And this helps you to ensure that you're getting the most business value out of any expenditures that you have on various cloud platforms. So if you're interested in checking out Stratosphere, then head over to our website at stratusgrid.com, and we would love to book a demo with you so that we can show you the platform and how it works. Now, the topic for this video is going to be on the Azure Front Door service. And previously, Azure Front Door was preceded by the Azure CDN or Content Delivery Network service. And Azure Front Door actually still works very closely with CDN. It's actually just an alternative to the CDN, but it actually has some more advanced features. So to better understand what Azure Front Door is capable of, I would encourage you to check out this article in the documentation called Front Door and CDN Comparison. And if you scroll down a little bit here, you'll see that there is a table that shows the service comparison right here. There's the old Azure CDN standard, which is one of the classic services that will most likely be retired eventually. And with the classic CDN service, the service only supported delivering static content. And that is one of the fundamental components of a CDN, is to distribute static content like images and video files and static HTML content or static, JavaScript assets or CSS assets to your application users. However, some CDN services, like the newer Front Door service here, actually supports delivering dynamic content as well. So you can actually put the Front Door service in front of your APIs or other web application front ends, and it will be able to serve up not just static content, but also dynamic content as well. Now, one of the other fundamental capabilities of a CDN service is basically what's called caching. So you'll see down here, there's this caching section. And what this allows you to do is to distribute a cached version or kind of a snapshot of a specific version of an asset and distribute that to many different endpoints around the world so that when users of your application request that particular asset, they'll have a copy that is closer geographically to them, which reduces the latency and improves performance of your web application. Now, the way that a CDN platform like this works is it routes requests that are coming in from clients to different services depending on the rules that you actually set up in the service itself when you provision it. So we're going to take a look at a really contrived and kind of basic sample of how you would set up Azure Front Door by setting up two different applications on a Azure virtual machine, and then we'll set up a front door in front of that Azure Virtual Machine, and depending on the routes that we set up in Azure Front Door, we'll route to either of those two different applications. Now, there's a lot of advanced features here as well that you can see are checked off. So there's, web application firewall rule integration here as well. There's also private link, which allows you to have a private virtual network connection to your Azure virtual machines or other resources on your Azure virtual network. There's DDoS protection. There's things like analytics capabilities here. You have access to the raw request logs as well if you need to run any analytics or troubleshooting on those. There's also health probes. So the Azure Front Door service kind of acts like a load balancer, and it's periodically checking your origins, your original application sources, to make sure that they're actually healthy and responding to requests. So we're going to take a look at how to set up Azure Front Door. And because we are also talking about cost optimization in the cloud, we want to make sure that Azure Front Door resources that we provision are actually doing some work and providing some business value rather than just spending money on them and not actually getting any business value from them. So we'll also take a look at the metrics available on Azure Front Door. Now, the reason that that's important, if you take a look at the Azure Front Door pricing page here, is because when you provision an Azure Front Door resource, whether it's a standard or premium SKU, there is a base monthly price for these resources. So for the standard SKU, it's $35 a month. And then for premium, it's $330 a month. So if you provision one of these resources and it's not actually doing any work, then it's costing you this base price at a bare minimum, and you're not getting any business value from it. In addition to the base provisioned price for each of these front door resources, there is also an added cost based on the amount of bandwidth that you are consuming. So for the first 10 terabytes per month in North America, it's 8.3 cents per gigabyte of data outbound to the internet. And then you also have a request pricing here as well. So based on the number of inbound requests that are coming in, you have a cost for standard SKU of 9/10 of a penny per 10,000 requests. And then if you're using the premium SKU, then you are paying 1.5 pennies per 10,000 requests for the first 250 million requests. So you kind of have to combine the base price for the SKU that you decide to provision, along with the amount of bandwidth that you're actually consuming, and along with the number of requests that you are actually consuming as well, to get your final cost for Azure Front Door. Now, there are a bunch of useful metrics for Azure Front Door, somewhere in the documentation here. If we go down to somewhere under monitoring, it's probably under operational excellence, monitoring, there is a reference here that shows the different metrics that are available. And these metrics can help us to determine if the Azure Front Door service is actually doing any work or if it's just sitting idle. So for example, we can use these operational metrics like what percentage of our total requests are HTTP 400 responses or HTTP 500 responses, indicating some kind of error is occurring. And then we also have a total request count here. So for starters, we can look at the total request count over the last maybe 24 hours or maybe the last 7 days. And if the total request count is 0, then that means that we're not actually doing any work with the front door service. So we're paying that base price to provision the resource, but we're not actually doing any work. Now, you do also want to balance that metric with the percentage of 400 and 500 errors here, because if you are getting 100% HTTP 500 errors from your total request count, then that means that even if you have 10,000 requests over the last 7 days or the last 24 hours, then if 100% of those are 500 errors, then we're not doing any actual real work, right? Because we're just getting errors returned rather than actually getting successful HTTP 200 responses, right? So there's a lot of useful metrics in here that you want to pay attention to. These are just built-in metrics that you get out of the box when you provision Azure Front Door. So these can help you to determine, again, across all the Azure Front Doors that you have provisioned, if they are doing useful work or if they are just costing you money without actually doing any real work. So we're going to go ahead and set up an example of Azure Front Door inside of a Microsoft Azure environment, and then we will have a better understanding of how it actually works. Now, it is pretty complex, so it's kind of as complex as you want to make it, because you as the developer are actually determining the different routing rules. So if you have multiple services set up, you have to kind of think about, all right, what are the conditions where I want a request coming into Front Door to be routed to service A versus service B? Is it based on the path of the URL? So if it's the root URL, then I go to maybe service A. If it's /API, then maybe I go to service B. There's all sorts of things you can do with that. So those are just some basic examples of how you might do routing, but there's routing capabilities for a lot of other properties as well. So maybe the domain name that the request was made for, if it was api.mydomain.com, like api.stratusgrid.com, or maybe web.stratusgrid.com or www.stratusgrid.com, you can use that inbound domain name to help you determine where that request should go as well. So make sure that you check out the documentation for Azure Front Door to better understand all of the different routing rules that are supported for Azure Front Door, but we're just going to stick with kind of a contrived example for the time being. So we're going to start from scratch here. I don't want there to be any smoke and mirrors. So the first thing that we typically do in Azure is we create what's called a resource group, just to logically group together all of our resources. So typically when I'm setting up a new workload, I like to create a new resource group that's dedicated to that particular purpose. So I'll call this Trevor Sullivan dash front door dash video. And the region for that resource group doesn't really matter too much because a resource group can actually contain resources from multiple different Azure regions. And the resource group itself does not actually do anything. It's not like creating a virtual machine or creating a storage account or anything like that. So it's really quick to create that resource. So let me just refresh here and open up this resource group. And then what I want to do is provision a virtual machine into this resource group so that we can spin up a couple of sample applications that we will then front with the Azure Front Door service. So what we'll do is go back to the search bar. We'll search for virtual machines. And I'll say I want to create an Azure virtual machine here. And virtual machines have a lot of different options available. But for now, I'll just call it Trevor Front Door Video. And then I'll use Ubuntu latest here. I'll leave it at 64 Intel AMD 64-bit rather than ARM 64-bit here. I'll choose B1S should probably be fine, although I am actually going to bump it up to the 2 gig model here, which is the B1MS burstable. And then I'm also going to choose a password here just so I don't have to worry about setting up a public key or anything like that. So I'll do Trevor and then bacon123 exclamation is my password. Actually, let me try something else here. And then once I've got my SSH password set up, then we are going to specify what inbound ports we want. You can always change these later on by configuring your network security group as well. So I'm just going to skip that for the time being. For the storage type here, I'll just choose standard SSD. That's a little less expensive. And I don't think I really need to choose many other options here. I am going to make sure I have a public IP address here because that public IP is where we are going to route requests from the Azure Front Door service. And then I'll choose to delete the public IP and network interface when the VM is deleted as well. For load balancing, I don't need anything there. For the management features, I don't really need anything there either. So we'll just click on Review and Create. And then we'll go ahead and create our Azure virtual machine. And then we'll be able to SSH into it and actually run a couple of containers on it so that we can spin up a couple sample applications for us to route through the front door service. So we'll give that virtual machine a moment to create, and then we will SSH into it. So let me come back to resource groups here. I've actually already got this one opened up right here in another tab. So let's go ahead and just refresh right here. And in just a few moments, you'll see that that virtual machine deploys into here. Of course, I think I chose the wrong resource group, so it may have automatically created a new one for me anyway, which is totally fine. Yeah, I think this is it right here. I think it actually, by default, just creates a new resource group for you. So a lot of other services, when you provision them, actually prompts you to select a resource group rather than just creating a new one automatically for you. So that's why sometimes I forget to do that. So we're going to stick with this resource group since it decided to create it for me here. Now, one of the things I'm going to do is go into the network security group while I have it in mind, and we're going to go to inbound security rules here. And I'm going to make sure that I open up ports 80 to 81 here, because I'm going to create one web application that runs on port 80 and one that runs on port 81, just so we have two different applications running. And we need to make sure that we allow inbound access to those services so that the Azure Front Door CDN service can actually hit the Azure Virtual Machine on ports 80 and 81. Okay, so now that that's done, let's go ahead and come back to the virtual machine itself. And there will be a public IP address here for the VM that we can go ahead and just copy to our clipboard here. And then I'm going to open up a new shell and we will SSH. Let me cd/ here to open up some more screen space. And then we'll say SSH Trevor at that IP address. And then I'll plug in my SSH password here. And so now we've got access to this brand new VM. So now what I'm going to do to run a couple of different applications is install Docker. So I'll say sudo apt install docker.io. Normally, if you were going to install Docker, I would actually recommend following the Docker documentation because it actually has a newer version of Docker than what is in the default Ubuntu repositories here. But for the time being, whatever version is available in the Ubuntu repositories should be fine. So it looks like version, let's see which version is going to be installed here. I think we'll see that after it actually gets installed here. But once the Docker engine is installed, then we can go ahead and just run a couple of different container images as web servers. And we'll map them to ports 80 and 81. So just to give you a little context here, if I go out to the Docker Hub at hub.docker.com, there is a default image for Nginx. And so this will just serve up a static web page by default. And then if we search for Apache here as well, there is a Apache image. I think it might be called HTTPD. And this serves up a different web page. So we'll basically just have two different static web pages using the default web pages for each of these images that we will use to kind of detect when we are routing to two different web applications. All right, so now I will do a sudo usermod, append the Docker group to my Trevor user here, and then we'll SSH back into it so that I have access to the Docker group. So let me do a login here. And so now I should be able to do a Docker pull Nginx. All right, and then we'll also pull the HTTPD image as well. And then we'll just run two different containers from each of those images. So let's do a Docker run -- restart always, and we'll say publish port 80 to port 80 in the container. And that'll be the Nginx container. And I need to do detach there as well. So let's say -- detach. And let me do a Docker PS because we already created this container here. So it's complaining about port conflicts. So we'll say docker rm-f 7c66. And then we'll go ahead and run this again with the detach parameter this time. So then we'll do the same thing, but we're going to change the port to port 81 because we can't share a port. And then we'll specify the HTTPD service here. So then we'll download that container image and spin up a different service. So now if we do a Docker PS, you can see we've got an HTTPD service and we have an Nginx service. So if I hit the VM on port 81, it'll be the HTTPD service. And if I hit it on port 80, it'll be Nginx. So we can test that locally really quick. If we do HTTP or curl localhost, by default, that's port 80. So that's the same thing as doing :80 there. But if I change the colon to :81, you can see we just get it works. So the Nginx page is a little bit more complex here, but if it's HTTPD, it's just going to say it works. So now we have two different applications running on the same Azure Virtual Machine. So when we set up the Azure Front Door CDN service, we can set up routing rules to determine if it's going to go to one or the other origin. So now that we've got the VM set up here, and the network security group rules to allow that through to the VM, we are going to set up the CDN service. So if we search for front door and CDN profiles here, we can just hit create, and then we can choose Azure Front Door, custom create here. And there's going to be a lot of different options that we can choose here. I'm going to choose the resource group that we already created for the VM. And then the profile here, I'm just going to call this Trevor SG-video. I'm going to choose the front door standard tier, which is $35 a month rather than the $330 a month premium tier. We don't need any secrets here. For the endpoints, we should be able to add these later, I think. And then I'm just going to add a resource owner here. So let's see. I think we do need to actually configure an endpoint here. So let's configure an endpoint, and we'll call this Trevor SG video endpoint and say add. Okay, and once we've got that endpoint configured here, you're going to see it creates a domain name for us here just based on some random characters and the name of the endpoint itself. So if we actually take a look at that in Notepad right here, it has this format of domain name. So we're going to get this public domain name under the Azure FD.net DNS zone. And so we'll be able to access the web application using that built-in domain name. Now, one of the other things you can do is actually map a custom domain name. So if you purchase a domain name, you can actually set up a CNAME record to point over to this Azure FD.net domain name that's generated for you. And that's normally how you would set up an application, but I'm not going to go into the details for the sake of this video into the custom domain names. So now what we need to do is set up two different routes. So I'm going to set up route 01 and route 02, depending on which of the endpoints we want to hit. So if it is going to /* here, so just under the root of the domain name, so domain name / nothing, then it is going to route to the first application, which is going to be Nginx on port 80. If it's /API, then I want it to route to the port 81, which is the HTTPD It Works service. Now, one of the things that we have an option to do here is to say what protocols are we going to accept. And because we're coming in from the outside across the internet, we generally want to secure this down to HTTPS only. Now, if you choose that option, then you will only have access to the domain name using an auto-generated certificate for HTTPS using Transport Layer Security, or TLS. And you also have this checkbox here, so if somebody tries to go to HTTP without the S on it, then it will force a redirect to HTTPS anyways. So now that we've specified what the outbound, or what the external configuration looks like here, now we say, based on that incoming request, where do we want to send traffic to? And so this is where we can set up what's called an origin group here. So we'll say add an origin group, and I'll call this origin 01, and we'll say add an origin here, and this will be origin 01. Technically, the thing back here is origin group 01. Then we'll say add an origin 01. The origin type, we have a lot of different options here. So where do we want to send the traffic to if it goes to the root of our Azure Front Door? So we could say, I want to host a static website on Azure Blob Storage. I could host an application in Azure App Service. I could forward the network traffic to API management if I want to. But in this case, I'm actually going to forward to a public IP address that I've provisioned on my Azure Virtual Machine. Now I can choose my Trevor Front Door video IP right here. That is the public IP of my Azure Virtual Machine. So that makes it really easy. I don't have to copy and paste it. It just automatically allows me to choose that from the wizard right here. Also, we are going to choose the HTTP port here. That's going to be port 80. We're not doing HTTPS from the Azure Front Door to the Azure Virtual Machine. We're only doing TLS from the client to Azure Front Door. So once Azure Front Door receives that request, it will forward it using standard HTTP to the Azure Virtual Machine within the Microsoft Azure network. So we'll say enable this origin. That's fine. And then we'll say add. And then down here, we have the ability to set up that health probe. So periodically, the Front Door service is going to check to make sure that that service is healthy on port 80 using a simple HTTP request to it. It's going to use the head type of HTTP request, which is not a full request. It's basically just doing a head request to make sure that that service is alive. And then we can say add. And then the origin path here is optional. By default, it's just going to go to the root of the target application. Or actually, no, technically by default, it's going to forward whatever path was specified from the request here. So if I say DNS name /API, it will pass that into the origin. But I can actually override that with the origin path here, which is important when we get to the next origin that we are going to set up. So when we set up a second route with a second origin, that is where it's going to be important, because we have to make sure that we strip off the /API and actually just forward it to /nothing, because that is how our web application is set up. All right, so if we go to forwarding protocol here, we're going to say only go to HTTP. If we try to say match incoming request, then it's going to try to hit the target virtual machine on HTTPS. and we do not have HTTPS configured on the virtual machine. We only have port 80 using standard HTTP on the Nginx and HTTPD services. So we want to make sure that we choose HTTP there unless you explicitly set up your application to use HTTPS. We also want to enable caching right here. And we can say, all right, I want to enable caching, but when I enable caching, I also want to include any query string parameters to choose how to respond to the cache requests as well. So that's an option that you'll generally want to enable. That is optional, but generally speaking, you're going to get the most value out of Azure Front Door when you enable caching, because that will speed up the responses for your end users of your application. All right, so let's add route 01, and then we should be able to add another route here, but it looks like maybe we need to do that after we actually create the front door service here. All right, so what we're going to do is when we curl our Azure Front Door endpoint here, so let me go ahead and paste in, I think, my DNS name right there. So when we paste this in, we want this to hit the Nginx front end, the Nginx static page. But when we go to this /API, this is the path on our URL that we want to configure Front Door to send to our secondary service, which we're going to pretend at this point is an API, even though it's not, it's just a static web page. So we want /API to go to the HTTPD it works service. But if we take the /API off and just go to the root of that domain for Azure Front Door, then we want that to go to Nginx. So once our Azure Front Door profile is configured, it should theoretically, instead of providing us this error page here, it should theoretically be going to the Nginx service instead. Now, the CDN can take a few minutes to provision, so let me go ahead and just pause the video while the resource is provisioning, and once it's available, we'll go ahead and come back. If you'd like to monitor the deployment, you can go to the resource group where you provisioned the Front Door resource, and then you can go down to Settings and then Deployments right here. And you'll see that the first deployment that we did here was for the Azure Virtual Machine. And then the second deployment that we have here is the one for the Azure Front Door service. You can even view the Azure Resource Manager JSON template that was generated by the wizard to create this CDN profile for Azure Front Door. So just keep an eye on this screen right here, and you can click on refresh to see when the status of the Azure Front Door deployment changes from deploying to succeeded. All right, and as you can see right there, just a second later, it went ahead and succeeded. So now, provided that everything is set up correctly, when we ran through the wizard, we should be able to curl this domain name here, and we should be getting the Nginx front end. Now, you might be getting an error page if you try to hit this, because it is going to block by default from the network security group. But as you remember, we did set up a security group rule that allows inbound access to our Azure virtual machine. So one of the things that we might want to test first is to make sure that we can curl the Azure Virtual Machines public IP. So what we'll do is come back here to our resource group and then go to our Azure Virtual Machines IP address. We'll go ahead and just copy that. And let's go ahead and try to curl it from the VM itself. So we'll say curl HTTP on port 80. And yeah, that is working correctly here. So if we come back over to our resource group and then open up the Azure Front Door resource, we should be able to kind of investigate if there are any issues here. Inside of the resource group, you'll see your Front Door profile. So we'll open up our Front Door profile. And then if we come over to Front Door Manager here, you can see that we have our route here that we originally configured, and then we can also add in additional routes. Let's go ahead and drill into this route here to see if we can figure out what's going on. Maybe there's just a little bit of a delay in getting the CDN to work right here. The other thing that we can do is just plug in this URL into our web browser here and say continue to site. And as you can see, it is getting page not found. So we'll come back over to the Azure CDN profile right here, or front door profile. Let's drill into the route right here. So the route is configured correctly right here. We've got patterns to match. We're accepting HTTPS on the outside. We've got our origin group right here, which we will look at in a moment. We are specifying nothing for the origin path, which should be fine because we're just going to the root for now. And we also have the forwarding protocol to be HTTP, not HTTPS, which is correct. So that all looks correct. We can also go to the origin group configuration right here. So let's take a look at our origin group and make sure that our origin is set up correctly. So we've got our IP address for our Azure Virtual Machine right there. We've got our health probes configured, and it looks like this is all set up correctly. So let's give it a second and see if it starts showing up. So while we're waiting a few minutes for the Azure Front Door service to come online, we can go ahead and set up our other origin as well and our other routing configuration. So let's go to origin groups here for starters. And before we create the routing, we'll go ahead and just specify the origin group. And so we'll create a group here called origin group 02. And then we'll add our origin again. We'll say origin 02 this time. And the origin type is going to be the same. It's going to be the public IP address right here. And so the host name is going to be our virtual machine right here. And then we've got our IP address that we're going to connect to. Now for the HTTP port down here, this is what we're going to change this time. So the default normally is port 80, that's our Nginx service, but we ran the HTTPD service on port 81, so we're going to specify port 81 instead. All right, let's go ahead and just add that origin to the configuration right here. We're also going to say enable the health probe. It's going to hit the port 81 on that IP address under the root path here. And it's going to use HTTP again for the health probe because our application is not configured to use HTTPS here. So we'll go ahead and add that second origin group. And then once the origin group has been created, we'll also need to create the second routing rule on our front door manager in order to route certain requests for /API over to that secondary service. So what we're going to do this time is use the origin path override to specify that if the inbound request is coming to /API, we actually want to change that request when it forwards it to the origin to just have /nothing instead. Okay, so our second origin group has now been created right here, and we're going to come over to our front door manager. In fact, you might have noticed that you can see our origin group 02 is unassociated, and that's basically just saying that we've configured the origin group, but we haven't bound it to the endpoint yet. So back under the front door manager, we are going to add it under a new route here. So let's say add a new route, and this time we're going to call it route 02. And this time, the patterns to match here is not going to be /star. What we're going to do is say /API, because any requests that are coming in for our DNS name here, /API for the URL path part, that is what we want to route to our second service on port 81 instead of port 80. So again, for accepted protocols here, we're going to say we only accept HTTPS connections. For the origin group down here, we're going to specify origin group 02. And for the origin path, remember that when we configured the first route, we just left origin path as nothing. But this time, what we're going to do is specify a / here, because if we don't do that, then the default configuration is to take /API from the inbound request from our client that gets sent to this DNS endpoint, and it's just going to pass the /API on to the origin. But what we want to do here is basically rewrite the request so that if it comes in for /API, we're actually sending it to just / for that service. All right, so for the forwarding protocol, again, we're going to choose HTTP only because our application, the HTTPD service itself that we ran in the container, is not configured for TLS. So then we'll go ahead and add that second route to our front door configuration. Okay, so now you can see our second route has successfully been created here. And so now anytime that we go to /API on our front door domain name, it should route to the secondary service on port 81 on our VM. and any requests for the root should continue to go to route 01 here. In fact, anything that doesn't explicitly match /API will go to route 01. So let's go back to our browser here and see if Front Door is loaded yet, and it looks like it is still in the configuring state. All right, so after waiting about another hour or so, I went to another meeting and then came back to kind of finish up this recording here. It looks like our CDN through Azure Front Door has finally decided to start working here. So the provisioning time can take a little while at its initial provisioning time, or if you make certain changes to the Azure Front Door configuration, it can take a little bit of time. But as you can see, we are navigating to our Front Door instance right here at the root URL. So we don't have anything on our URL path here. But if we go to /API instead, you can see we get it works right here. So provided that you have everything set up correctly with your routes and origins and everything, you really shouldn't need to enable caching unless you really want to. So for static content, oftentimes it makes sense to enable caching. And depending on what type of dynamic content you're serving, you might actually want to use caching for some dynamic content, as that can improve application performance. However, when you're caching dynamic content, you also want to be aware of the fact that the cache can sometimes interfere with serving up brand new content. So if somebody, let's say, adds a database record and then they try to refresh the page that lists all your records, then the cache can sometimes interfere with that. So you want to make sure that you're using the correct cache keys inside of your query string parameters to make sure that your cache is being updated when your data source behind the scenes in your API is being updated as well. But for static content, caching works pretty seamlessly here. And so as you can see, we're able to route to these two different applications that are running on the same virtual machine because we have two different routes set up. One has /API and the other does not. Now, as I mentioned before, if we try to go to another URL that's not in any of our routes, if we try to do something like /StratusGrid, for example, you'll see that we get 404 not found. And this 404 not found is actually coming from Nginx. It's not coming from the HTTPD service. And the reason that that's happening, if we go back to our Front Door manager here, is that on route 01, which is the one that's forwarding traffic to the Nginx service on our VM on port 80 instead of port 81, we have a pattern to match right here. And the pattern to match is /star. Or asterisk, depending on your preference there. And so any routes that are not explicitly supported by other route configurations on the Front Door manager are going to, by default, match to Nginx. Now, the way that Front Door handles routing here is that it's going to go with the most specific route. So because /API could still match /asterisk, the more specific route here, /API, because it doesn't use a wildcard, that is considered to be more specific than /star. And so therefore, the Front Door service is going to prioritize the more specific route over the more vague route that is handled by the /asterisk. So that's why this still works, even though /star would technically match /API here. Now we can also set up multiple paths here. So if we had /StratusGrid added to this one as well, we can just change that. We could have multiple different patterns matching to the same origin here. And so if we were to specify that here, and then we come back here and refresh this /StratusGrid path here, eventually after the Front Door service updates, which could take several minutes, this will end up routing to the HTTPD service instead of Nginx as well. So this is actually an array of patterns to match. It's not just a singular pattern to match here. So check out the documentation on Azure Front Door if you're interested in learning more about the route prioritization. They actually do go into some examples in the documentation about how exactly that works. So if we were to search for route matching right here, this document right here gives a table of examples based on some different domain names and paths, and it'll tell you, so if you have a routing rule that matches / on contoso.com or www.contoso.com, on the root, it'll just match to the root. But down here, if you have a routing rule /star, which is what we had set up, but you have another more specific route like /AB. If you go to /AB on contoso.com, that'll actually match C instead of B because that is more specific. So make sure that you check out this documentation here on how to do route matching in order to better understand exactly how those different route paths are being prioritized in your Azure Front Door configuration. All right, so now that we've talked about that, the last thing I wanted to cover really quickly is just the metrics on your Azure Front Door service. So if we go over to the monitoring section here on our Front Door CDN profile, there's a bunch of useful metrics here. One of those metrics is actually the origin health. So if we check out origin health right here, this will show us over the last hour, let's say, what our origin health looks like. And generally, you want this to be as close to 100% as possible. So as you can see, there are some dips in availability here. Anytime that we're making a change to our Azure Front Door configuration, you can see that our origin health goes down to 0, and then it spikes back up to 100%. You can also split this out across origins too, because right now we are looking at an aggregated view of the 2 different origin groups that we have. But if you click on this button here called Apply Splitting, we can say I want to split across the 2 different origin groups that I have. Or if I have more than 2 different origins, I could even split across the individual origins within the origin groups as well. But for now, we just have 2 different origin groups and 1 origin in each of those 2 different groups. And so now I can see if I hover over this blue line right here, that's the availability of origin group 01. And if I hover over the pink line right here, that is the availability of origin group 01. Sorry, I had that backwards. The blue line is origin group 02, and pink is origin group 01. So this gives us the ability to see the availability of our origins, which is good from a health perspective. And then let's go ahead and look at another metric here that's very useful, which is the request count. So as you can see right here, if we take a look at our request count over the last 30 minutes, once the Azure Front Door service became available sometime in the last approximately hour or so, and we started actually hitting the Azure Front Door service from our web browser, you can see that the number of requests has increased here. So this is what's going to tell us, is there actual traffic being utilized on this Azure Front Door instance? And then the other thing that we can do is take a look at those percentages here. So what is the percentage of HTTP 400 errors versus successful requests with an HTTP 200 response code? And so we can see that percentage right here. Previously, it was 100% across certain time periods here. I can also take a look at 500s here. So if I get any HTTP 500 error codes, it looks like we just have a flat line right there. So there are no 500s occurring here, but if there was an internal server error or something of that nature on the origin service, then we would definitely see those HTTP 500 response codes showing up there. So these metrics are very helpful to determine if the Azure Front Door CDN profile is actually being consumed and actually adding some business value, or if it is simply idle and is a resource that we could clean up and reduce our overall cloud expenditure. So these are really useful metrics. Feel free to check out the metrics in the metrics section here. You can also access those from the Azure Monitor service directly. So one of the nice things about Azure is that you can actually go into a specific resource and then see the metrics for that specific resource. Or if you want to go more broadly into all of your different resource metrics, you can just navigate to the Azure Monitor service, and then you can click on metrics right here. And this will allow us to see the metrics for all the different types of resources that we have available in our Azure subscriptions here. If I drill into this resource group right here, you can see I've got my CDN profile resource right here. So we can check that off and say apply, and then we can see all of these metrics here, just like we did when we were directly on that resource. But this allows us to drill in and add other metrics from other types of resources as well. And then we can actually save these metric graphs to our Azure dashboard as well. So if I wanted to create a graph here that has my origin health and then apply the splitting on the origin group, and then maybe change it to the last hour here so I can see this graph, I can say save this to my dashboard. And so now I can see my origin health over here on my dashboard for my Azure Front Door resource. So there's a lot of flexibility that we have here, but I just wanted to kind of give you a brief introduction into how the Azure Front Door service works and show you some of the metrics that you can use to determine the utilization level of your front door services so that you can eliminate any services that you don't need from your Azure environment and make sure that you achieve good cost optimization and cost efficiency in your cloud platforms. Again, you can head out to stratusgrid.com if you would like to book a demo meeting with us to talk about Stratosphere, which is available at stratosphere.app. That's Stratosphere with a U, not an O. And so we'd love to talk to you and show you around the platform if you are interested in seeing that. So I hope that this video has been valuable to you. Please leave a comment down below and let us know what you thought of this video and other topics that you are interested in seeing on our channel around cost optimization in the cloud. And we'd also love it if you would leave a like on the video and subscribe to our channel as well, so we can bring you more great content. Thanks so much for watching. Again, my name is Trevor Sullivan, Solutions Architect with StratusGrid and an AWS Ambassador. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Take care.